The night on Kepler 62f always carried a quietude that simply didn't exist on any other planet Ethan Miles had ever set foot on. It wasn't a total silence, not the harsh, absolute vacuum of space where sound utterly ceased, nor the profound, desolate hush of Earth's deepest untouched wilderness. Here, the silence felt less like an absence and more like a presence. It was a breathing entity, moving slowly, observing gently from a distance, a soft-hued blanket draped across the galaxy. Ethan stood alone on the hexagonal observation deck of the Orion 5 research station, his breath misting slightly inside the protective field of his open helmet, which he wore more out of habit than necessity in the breathable but thin atmosphere. He looked up at the deep, royal violet sky, which was constantly being swept by shimmering nebulae, vast, luminous currents that looked like soft strands of cosmic silk caught in an eternal slow-motion ballet. The air was cool and sparse, carrying the distinct, sterile scent of chilled minerals and trace metals from the distant, jagged mountain ranges, instilling a profound sense that he was living deep inside a dream that stretched on, vast and unending, with no definite point of waking. Ethan brought the heavy, insulated steel mug to his lips, raising it slowly. He took a long, thoughtful sip of the lukewarm, slightly bitter coffee, tasting the faintest echo of Earth's familiar bitter soil in the engineered bean substitute. The tepid temperature didn't bother him. He found comfort in its gentle, almost forgotten warmth. The scent of the brew, faint and fading as it was, carried a human familiarity, a necessary, mundane anchor that kept the mind tethered. In a world positioned hundreds of light years away from the sun he grew up under, light taking centuries to crawl between the stars, these small, sensory details were vital. They were the gentle chains of memory. The intense, deep violet glow from the star-laced heavens reflected faintly off the polished glass of his full-face helmet, which was resting upside down on the metal railing beside him, causing it to emit a soft, internalized glow, like a strange, captured sphere of phosphorescent light. Ethan placed the mug down carefully on the cold metal of the rail, leaned his body into the support, and released a long, slow sigh, a breath heavy with the weight of both time and distance. He allowed the vast, indifferent darkness to wash over him, a gentle yet overwhelming presence. 15 months, he whispered, the sound immediately absorbed by the atmosphere, his voice sounding dry and brittle even to his own ears. His gaze drifted far past the planetary horizon, lost in the star-dusted velvet beyond. 15 long months out here, and still, at times, it feels exactly like day one. He thought about the rotational period of Kepler 62f, its short, hurried days and its long, luminous nights. Time felt fluid and meaningless here, a cosmic joke played on a species so obsessed with clocks. His only true markers were the rhythmic pulse of the life support and the slow accumulation of dust on the rover. Kepler 62f was undeniably a beautiful planet, perhaps overwhelmingly so, yet its beauty always felt too meticulously rendered, too flawless to be real. A soft, perpetual halo of light constantly surrounded the colossal violet dunes, making them appear as if they had been carefully brushed and airbrushed with thick oil paint by some celestial artist. The thick atmosphere was always dense with slow, glowing currents that streamed and flowed across the sky like tranquil, liquid rivers of captured starlight. But that pervasive, overwhelming beauty was never enough to completely fill the profound, existential void of his loneliness. The solitude here wasn't the simple, manageable quiet of being alone in a large house or an empty subway car. It was the terrifying, echoing stillness of standing at the center of a colossal, endless cosmic desert, knowing with chilling certainty that there was not a single, warm-blooded, familiar creature to share a breath, a thought, or a moment with. It was an overwhelming emptiness that felt easily accessible, a palpable sensation on his skin, yet was impossible to truly acknowledge or dispel. Ethan finally retreated from the overwhelming beauty of the deck, turning his back to the stars, and walked inside the station's long, echoing corridor. The interior lights within Orion 5 were deliberately filtered to a soft, nostalgic amber, a deliberate choice to mimic the gentle, welcoming glow of a living room lamp back home on a quiet, snowy winter night. All of humanity's concentrated efforts here were meticulously aimed at making the small team of deep space researchers long since gone, leaving only him forget they were truly inhabiting an impossibly distant, alien world. But the harsh, emotional truth was relentless. No matter how many soft amber lights, how many white noise generators played pre-recorded, comforting audio loops of rainfall, how many synthetic, protein-rich meals vaguely smelled of Sunday roasted chicken, in the quietest, deepest parts of his heart, he was still profoundly, devastatingly alone. He moved into the central control room, a circular space dominated by interface screens that cast a cool, analytical blue glow. They displayed a dense, flowing cascade of data and telemetry. Ethan's eyes, trained to find the faintest flicker of anomaly, quickly scanned the routine, pre-programmed report. Atmospheric winds stable, planetary atmosphere nominal, deep space radiation levels surprisingly low. Everything was relentlessly normal, just as it had been for the 335 Martian souls he had spent monitoring this inert outpost. But just as he reached out a weary hand to initiate the system shutdown sequence and seek his restless sleep, a thin, almost invisible signal line appeared in the extreme corner of the main sensory monitor. It was so minute, so subtle, that he initially dismissed it, thinking the optic fiber screen itself had developed a transient glitch. He leaned in slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly in concentration, a familiar scientific curiosity overcoming his deep fatigue. A faint signal wave, it was undeniably peculiar. It was incredibly weak, yet its form was perfectly clean and distinct. It was not the chaotic, jagged signature of cosmic static, nor was it the predictable, decaying echo from the station's own equipment bouncing off the nearby ionosphere. It possessed a delicate, almost mathematical rhythm, a steady, perfect, even pulse, repeating itself with chilling precision every 12 minutes. Ethan focused the screen to magnify the waveform, studying its smooth, almost melancholic symmetry. Huh, he chuckled, the sound barely audible over the hum of the air circulation. It wasn't a sound of amusement or relief. It was the quiet, almost startled sound of a logical mind confronting a beautiful contradiction it couldn't yet categorize. Where did you come from, you tiny, strange thing? He carefully activated the signal to audio processing function. The small, high-fidelity speakers embedded in the control room bulkhead produced a single, thin, sustained hum, a low, drawn-out frequency that sounded precisely like a gentle breath of wind, carefully touching a fine-tuned, tensioned string. Crucially, it was not the sound of a human voice. It was not the crisp, rhythmic tap of Morse code. It was not any conventional technical signal format or protocol he had encountered in his decade of deep space communications work. It sounded, incredibly, precisely like someone sighing from an incomprehensible distance. A low, melancholic breath, soft and drawn out, a sonic whisper so profoundly faint that it could only be perceived and registered because the entire control room was held in such a deep, unnatural silence. Ethan stood utterly motionless for what felt like endless seconds, his gaze fixed on the signal line, feeling an unsettling sense that the intangible pattern was somehow looking back into him. What truly sent a gentle tremor through him wasn't fear of the unknown, but a sudden, intense wave of strange familiarity. It was as if he had heard that exact, mournful sound, that perfect emotional frequency, in some long-forgotten childhood dream. It was a profound, aching sound of quiet sorrow and weary waiting. He began the transcription for his research log, his voice slow and intentionally measured, ensuring every word was a soft ripple in the quiet. Day 457. Detected a linear, cyclical signal with a consistent 12-minute interval. The tonal quality is remarkably pure and stable. The calculated source appears to be physically fixed, or perhaps purposefully maintained in a singular location. I am unable to determine its fundamental nature yet, but there is something intrinsically and emotionally different about it. It carries a tremendous sense of weight. The complex process of triangulation, relying on 3 different aging parabolic antennas, took an agonizingly long 3 minutes to process. When the final coordinates materialized on the main screen, pinpointing the origin with unnerving accuracy, Ethan could only stand paralyzed, the quiet shock settling deep in his core. The signal source was located precisely 82 kilometers northeast of the Orion 5 station, in a notoriously desolate region, simply and mysteriously designated on the orbital maps as the Desert of Whispers. He had never ventured there. No one in the history of the Kepler 6-2F mission had. Automated long-range scanners had occasionally registered several minor, non-threatening magnetic field fluctuations within the zone, but nothing that warranted investigation. It was simply strange. That long, cold night, Ethan lay upon the narrow, hard cot in his sterile sleeping module. He had closed his eyes, drawing the thermal blanket up to his chin, but he couldn't sink into any meaningful sleep. The signal continued to loop and resonate within the silent chambers of his memory, light and delicate as the barely audible sound of fine purple sand slipping slowly underfoot. It carried no threat, only an immense cosmic melancholy. A pervasive sadness so deep it made the usually numb area around his own ribcage ache faintly, as if a long, dormant emotional wound had been gently reopened. He rolled slowly onto his side, then onto his back, opening his eyes to stare up at the perfectly blank beige ceiling. "What are you?" he whispered to the all-consuming darkness, the question more a desperate plea for connection than an inquiry. Outside, the steady wind sighed against the station's cylindrical hull, creating a low, echoing bass note, a profound, lonely sound, like the deep resonance of a distant oceanic tide on an empty coast. Ethan eventually drifted into a sleep that was threadbare and shallow, filled with strange, comforting half-dreams. He saw a soft, overwhelming wash of deep sapphire light, a gigantic, perfect metallic circle half buried in the shifting sand, and the persistent, overwhelming feeling of unseen eyes watching him not with malice or judgment, but with an intense, quiet yearning, simply asking to be seen, to be remembered. When the pale, ethereal violet light of the pre-dawn finally began to spill softly through the narrow viewport, Ethan sat bolt upright and knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and science, that he had to embark on the journey. It was not driven by the rational demands of his scientific duty, but by a strange, quiet, emotional summons deep within his own spirit. An immediate, undeniable, and utterly inexplicable impulse. It was as if the faint, beautiful signal was simply waiting patiently for him to arrive. He meticulously prepared his field gear, the pressurized silver-gray exploration suit, fresh air filters, purified water rations, compact nutrient paste tablets that tasted like tasteless cardboard, and the miniaturized high-gain receiver for on-site signal analysis. The station's heavy, six-wheeled rover, a necessary piece of rugged American engineering, sat waiting silently in the lower storage bay, a visible, delicate layer of the fine purple dust clinging stubbornly to its reinforced viewport. Ethan ran the critical system checks, battery life, hybrid fuel levels, navigation system, all lights glowed green. When the massive primary hangar door hissed and ground open, the chilling, sharp morning air clean and carrying the characteristic, aromatic scent of the planet's unique violet mineral structure rushed into the bay. Ethan climbed carefully into the pilot's compartment, secured the complex safety harness around his chest, and initiated the operational sequence. The rover gave a single, solid, low-frequency tremor, then began its slow, deliberate roll down the shallow metal ramp outside the station. The further he drove the rover away from the familiar metallic safety of the outpost, the more intensely the desolate landscape took on a surreal, almost painterly beauty. The vast purple sand stretched out endlessly, an unbroken tapestry beneath the enormous, distant nebulae. The light from the far-off planetary sun wasn't a fierce, burning yellow, but was filtered into a gentle, soft lavender hue, making every single object appear as if it were subtly emanating light from within its own molecular structure. The wind, now his only companion, formed tiny, glittering vortices of dust around the rover's wheels, scattering them like brief, concentrated showers of captured stardust. Over the comms, a faint, haunting signal returned. This time, it sounded slightly rounder, infinitesimally clearer, like the gentle, consistent ring of a small, perfectly tuned glass bell, utterly forgotten in the constant sweeping wind. Ethan carefully increased the volume just enough to hear it distinctly, but not so loud as to disrupt the sacred, fragile atmosphere of peace and solitude. He found himself driving to the rhythm of the cyclical sigh, allowing his thoughts to drift, feeling less and less like a scientist and more like a pilgrim on an emotional quest. Approximately 4 slow, deliberate hours later, when the thin, morning atmospheric haze had fully burned away, he began to perceive a distinct, soft, persistent blue light on the planet's extreme horizon. At first, he suspected it was merely a trick of light, a complicated visual illusion caused by the harsh sunlight refracting through the unique atmosphere and the sand particles. But as the rover's wheels ate up the distance, the light became undeniable, clear, and perfectly consistent, spreading gently across the ground like the serene, tranquil phosphorescence of a shallow, unexplored ocean floor. Ethan slowed the rover's approach, a feeling of deep, quiet anticipation rather than tension settling over him. The light held no malice or intensity. It was soft, steady, and pulsed rhythmically, perfectly synchronized with the soft rhythm of the signal, like the slow, sleeping heartbeat of a giant, ancient organism. When the rover finally coasted to a complete stop atop the highest, silent purple dune, Ethan pushed the door seal release and stepped down carefully onto the cool, alien ground. The sound of his boots unnaturally loud in the vast quiet. Spread out before him was an artifact, a sight he had spent his entire life studying, but had never truly expected to behold. A colossal, perfect metallic ring, easily 60 meters in diameter, lay half submerged in the deep sand, like an immense, ancient structural skeleton patiently being claimed and buried by the relentless march of time. Its surface was not reflective, rather, it generated its own light, a clear, astonishingly pure blue, reminiscent of the most vibrant deep-sea bioluminescence. Faint, complex, almost biological-looking lines and grooves ran endlessly along the structure's perfect circumference, looking as though they had been meticulously carved not by industrial tools, but by patient, non-human hands, using immense, incomprehensible power. Ethan approached slowly, one step after another, his heart beating a soft, quiet, determined rhythm against the deep, profound silence. The wind sighed past his pressurized suit, causing the fine sand to cling lightly to his boots. When he extended his hand, encased in the thick glove, and finally touched the vast, smooth surface of the ring, a sharp but not unpleasant wave of coldness ran immediately up his arm. But it wasn't the bitter chill of freezing metal. It was a gentle, invigorating cold, like dipping a hand into a perfectly clear, deep spring. The high-gain radio signal chimed exactly at the moment his glove made perfect, solid contact. But instead of the familiar, mournful, lonely sigh he had tracked across the sky, the signal this time transformed, becoming a voiceless but clear message. It was a single, pure resonance, filled to capacity with complex, deep-seated emotions, profound lostness, eternal anticipation, fragile hope, and an immense, almost suffocating wave of sorrow. Ethan closed his eyes tightly, feeling the surge resonate in his own bones. His own slow, shallow breath mingled with the constant, even sound of the wind. He felt an immediate, overwhelming sense that this colossal, silent ring had once been the throbbing, joyful center of a place, perhaps an entire world that was once vibrant, crowded, and bursting with life and profound meaning. But now, it was nothing more than the cold, beautiful memory of things that had been tragically and completely lost to time and the vast indifference of the cosmos. He slowly opened his eyes, placing both of his palms flat against the magnificent, smooth metallic surface, closing his internal visor microphone, wanting to hear and feel the message with perfect clarity. Each time the signal gently pulsed, the blue light beneath his hands shimmered, a fragile, momentary flutter, like a final, desperate heartbeat. It was not the pulse of physical, biological life, but the steady, persistent survival of a memory too vast and too important to simply dissolve into the universal static. Ethan distinctly heard a voice resonate in the quiet theater of his mind, not composed of actual linguistic words, but of pure, crystalline feeling. Thank you. We waited. We are remembered. It was not a human voice, yet the sentiment was so utterly clear, so perfect in its transmission of yearning and relief, that it caused the muscles in his chest to contract sharply with an intense, familiar ache of shared humanity and profound connection. He didn't know the precise duration he stood there. It could have been a fleeting few minutes. It might have been an endless hour. The entire violet desert seemed to voluntarily halt its constant, slow-motion movement, leaving only the profound sound of the wind and the gentle, persistent blue light. Ethan's consciousness drifted and expanded, suspended weightlessly between the current moment and a time and place impossibly far away, as if the ancient, beautiful memory of an entire fallen civilization was now quietly, intimately whispering to him, asking him to carefully guard their remembrance. He touched the cool, smooth metal surface one final time, a gesture of reverence and farewell. This time, the signal felt undeniably warmer, closer, like the simple, comforting presence of a beloved companion finally sitting quietly beside him on a lonely, cold evening. Ethan finally whispered softly, his voice merely a dry rasp against the vastness, not expecting the wind or the structure to hear, but for the sake of his own soul. "I'm here. I remember you." The air and the deep ground around him seemed to gently vibrate in response. Not a true seismic tremor, just a deep, soft acknowledgement. A perfect, final answer. As if that immense, forgotten entity had truly, finally, heard him across the gulf of eons. And in that singular, profound moment, standing entirely alone in the endless, silent violet desert, Ethan Miles, who had lived in such deep, constant solitude for 15 long months, knew with an overwhelming certainty that he was no longer even remotely by himself. He felt a deep, warm kinship with the silence, an intense, unexpected connection shared with a beautiful, sentient memory of loss. It was a powerful, gently melancholic thought to carry back into the star-dusted velvet of the coming night, knowing that even across the impossible distances of light years and the crushing weight of elapsed time, the deepest currents of emotion, memory, and love somehow, inexplicably, still found a way to connect. The immense cosmos was a lonely place, but within its crushing solitude, there was always room for a gentle, whispered communion